How many of you saw the original documentary? Let me just check that out. Okay, a number of you did. It's, of course, the story of a number of Presbyterian ministers across the South who lived and served during the 60s primarily. And I'm going to tell my story today, but as we begin, I simply wanted to say to you that of that group, I think I knew personally nearly all of them. Phil Noble I did not know until the later years of his life after I moved to Atlanta. But of the others in that group, many of them I went to school with in seminary, and some of them I served with in the same Presbyterian Alabama. So it's a group that's dwindling fast, shall we say. And a number of them, and one of my closest friends in that group, Hugh Halverstadt, died fairly recently. So it's an interesting story, an interesting period of time, and for me to think now that we're 60 years from it makes me think again about how old I am. And as I look at this group, I realize that the folks who probably should be here are at least a generation or two younger than you, because they didn't live through any of this. And some of you probably are not aware of some of the issues that were going on. So as I tell my story today, please raise your hands anytime that you want to stop me or ask a question. I would simply ask you to hold up your hand and we'll get a mic to you so the folks who are watching online can continue to be with us. Would anybody volunteer to be the runner with the mic? Oh, Velma, good Velma. I'll give you I hope it's working. You may want to check it out. What I wanted to do first was to set some context. Always good to set the context. 1963, January, George Wallace becomes governor of Alabama, and in his inaugural speech says, "Segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever." April 3, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference volunteers kick off the Birmingham campaign against racial segregation with a sit-in. April 12, Martin Luther King, Ralph Abernathy, Fred Shuttlesworth, and others are arrested in Birmingham protest for parading without a permit. 4 days later, King issues his letter from the Birmingham jail. April 20, King posts bail and begins to plan more demonstrations. The Children's Crusade. If you remember the story, it was difficult for King to get adults engaged in that protest. Why? Because they knew that they were going to lose their jobs. So what do? Do you take care of your family? Do you provide for them? Or do you get out in the street and protest? So they came up with the idea of eliciting children to come and be engaged in that effort. So that's what the Children's Crusade was about. May 2, Public Safety Commissioner Bull Connor unleashes fire hoses and police dogs on thousands of African American protesters, many of them those children. June 4. Tom Farmer arrives in Greenville, Alabama. June 11, George Wallace barred 2 black youth from registering at the University of Alabama. Think where they'd be today. President Kennedy federalized the National Guard and Wallace stood aside. That incident and Kennedy's speech that night led to the Civil Rights Act of 1964. June 12 in Mississippi, NAACP leader Medgar Evers was gunned down outside his home in Jackson. August 28, the March on Washington. MLK's I Have a Dream speech before at least 250,000 people. November 22, President Kennedy assassinated in Dallas. December 27, Tom and Martha Farmer are united in marriage. 1964, the beginning. 24th Amendment outlawing poll tax, can you believe that, is ratified. February 7, an all-white jury in Jackson cannot reach a verdict in the Medgar Evers case. February February 9, does this make you feel old? The Beatles show up at Ed Sullivan's show. February 27, the Supreme Court rules that congressional districts must be approximately equal in population. March 8, Malcolm X is suspended from the Nation of Islam and says he will found the Black Nationalist Party. May 12, first draft card burning in the Vietnam War protest. I put that in there because all of a sudden you begin to see a change in focus. It was a change in focus for King, and it was a change in focus for the country. All of a sudden, racial things, they were still there, obviously, but all of a sudden, this war had taken front burner. June 14, Freedom Summer for registration of black voters begins in Mississippi. And you remember the murder of Cheney and Goodman and Schwerner by the Klan in Mississippi. July 2, Johnson signs the Civil Rights Act of '64. August 22, Fannie Lou Hamer challenges the all-white Mississippi delegation of the Democratic National Convention. And 25, September, Tom and Martha depart Greenville, Alabama. So I was a 14-month pastorate, folks. Now, let me back up. That's all of those. The fourth day of June, I pull up in a car that my father had given me for graduating from seminary. Actually, he gave it to me before I graduated from seminary. It was a nice black Ford Galaxy. I'll tell you, it was a very preacher car. And I'll tell you the rest of the story later about that car. Martha and I were trying to remember if I had a trailer on the back of it. I don't remember a trailer on the back of it. There are a lot of things 60 years ago that still are either I've lost completely or are very fuzzy in my mind. Whatever it was, it had all my earthly goods in it, which weren't many at that point, having been straight through college to seminary and then a call to Greenville, Alabama. I was 24 years old, so green behind the ears, to say the least. I'd grown up in a small town in southwestern Virginia. My father was a funeral director for most of my growing up life. When I finished seminary, he wanted to be a doctor, and he had to go home and take over the funeral home business because his dad got sick. And that wasn't what he wanted to do. So he finally sold the funeral home when I was finishing seminary. And anyway, I went on to Hampton-Sydney to college, did my 4 years there, was the youngest person in my class, went straight from college to Union Seminary in Richmond, was the youngest person in my class. So at age 24, here I am arriving in Greenville, Alabama. The town in which I had grown up had no black residents. The college in which I was educated had no black students. The seminary in which I did my work had no black students. So I came to Greenville, Alabama with a great deal of innocence. You know, Mac and I were talking about, you know, when you're in college, you're focused on other things. You've got other agenda. So the world was going on, and I paid some attention to it, obviously, but I wasn't totally engaged with it all. And I guess if anybody thought they could do something in the situation in Greenville, Alabama, maybe I had that innocent assumption about myself as I entered into the ministry there. I'll tell you a little later about the process of going into that ministry. Anyway, I pulled up alongside the church that day in my Ford Galaxy, and it was quiet. There was nobody around on the street that I could see. A fellow was mowing the grass on the church lawn. So I hop out of the car, and I go up and introduce myself, reach out, and I shake his hand, and I say, "I'm Tom Farmer. I'm a new pastor here at the church." Well, my ministry was over at that point. Dead. Why? I found out later that across the street in the doctor's office, somebody had seen me get out of the car and walk up and introduce myself and shake hands with a black man who was mowing the grass. And it was all over town. We're talking about a town of probably a little less than 5,000 people at that point. It was all over town that the new preacher at the Presbyterian Church was going to have them integrated in no time. So that was the end of my pastorate, I think, effectively, in Greenville, Alabama. I stayed on for 14 months, obviously, but not only was I the pastor in Greenville, I was the pastor at the Sandy Ridge Presbyterian Church, which was a small rural congregation in Lowndes County, Alabama. Anybody know about Lowndes County? Lowndes County, well, let me set Greenville for you in case you don't know where it is. It's about 40 miles southwest of Montgomery. If you're going down, there's an interstate now that goes all the way from Birmingham down to Montgomery on down to Mobile. It comes right by Greenville. In fact, one of the Robert Trent Jones golf courses is at Greenville. And Greenville, at that point, roughly 5,000. But the Sandy Ridge Church was located in Lowndes County. And I found this the other day. Stokely Carmichael in 1964 was registering black voters in Lowndes County and said it's the most backward and violent county in Alabama. Lowndes County was notorious. It was about 80% black. And how many registered voters do you think they might have had in Lowndes County? One black registered voter. I don't know how that one got registered, except maybe to say that the registrar could say, well, we do register black voters. But you know what the process was for trying to get registered. But the word was that, if you attempted to go register to vote, you just as well move out of your house and you no longer have a job. So that was the milieu in which I moved into that area, and the Sandy Ridge Church, as I said, was the little church was just outside of the town of Fort Deposit, which had a population of probably 1,300 at that point. It was a rural congregation, and basically most of the people in that congregation were farmers. There was a pharmacist in the congregation who may have been a little more sophisticated than some of the others, but they were the Auburn crowd. Let me put it that way. The folks at the Greenville church, at the First Church Greenville, were the Alabama crowd. The ag school versus the state university. So there was always that going on, and the two congregations didn't have a whole lot in common. As I experienced it later, I sort of figured that the Sandy Ridge congregation in Lowndes County would, if there had been Ku Klux Klanners, they would have been the Ku Klux Klan crowd. The town crowd in Greenville would have been the White Citizens Council group. I'll tell you another story about all that in a minute. On Sunday mornings, the new pastor had to have service at the Sandy Ridge Church. I don't remember exactly what time it was. It was probably 9:30 or so, 9:30 or 10. And then as soon as I finished the service and had greeted folks, I'd jump in the car and drive about 15, 20 miles into Greenville, literally jump in the pulpit and start again. So that was my routine on Sunday mornings. I didn't have any opportunity to be engaged in the Sunday school class at all at either place. So whatever opportunities I had for teaching came at other times and places than Sunday morning. The pulpit committees that called me were chaired by a man named Jack Williamson. And Jack will appear a number of times in my story. He was an attorney. He was a graduate of the University of Alabama Law School. A very bright, sophisticated kind of guy. His wife, Tyr, was from the same region, but she was born and bred Episcopalian. Nonetheless, she came with Jack to the Presbyterian Church. Jack had chaired the pulpit search committee, and it was, of course, a joint committee with the two congregations, but he was the top dog. In fact, those of us who know rural churches know that there's usually one chief leader in a rural church, and it may be a family, but it most often is one person, and that person usually calls the shots. Well, Jack was not only, he was that person in the Greenville church, even though the Greenville church was not a rural congregation, but he was the one that called the shots. And to illustrate how that happened, the first Sunday I was there, I had made the trek back from Sandy Ridge into the Greenville church, and I realized that these people were carrying electronic equipment out of the church. I couldn't figure out what was going on. Well, as it turns out, Jack Williamson taught Sunday school class in the sanctuary, and it was broadcast over the local radio station. And not the morning worship service, not the preacher involved, but Jack as the Sunday school teacher. Duh. What does that tell me about what my place is in this congregation? Old fool. So that sort of begins the story of Jack Williamson. The interesting thing, one of the most interesting things to me about my experience there was the difficulty of preaching. I think the most stressful part of my work week was having to make a decision about what text I would be preaching from on Sunday. This was back in the day when we didn't know much about lectionary preaching, and even though there was a lectionary in the back of the Book of Common Worship, nobody ever looked at it. So it was basically left up to the preacher to make some determination about what the Sunday morning sermon would be focused in. And it was at the point where I couldn't, every text I'd look at had something to do with the issue of race. You simply couldn't get away from it if you were honest. And so I would struggle and struggle with that. I never confronted the issue head on from the pulpit. But most everything I said, people could read between the lines and see what I was getting at. An illustration of the way things worked. Back in that day in the old Southern Presbyterian Church, and of course this was before reunion, so we're back in the PCUS, we had each month had a designation of something, and July was always Christian Citizenship Month, I guess because of the 4th of July, but it was Christian Citizenship Month. So from the denominational office here in Atlanta, we'd get a poster or a packet of material about Christian Citizenship Month, and I would take the poster up, and that first July I took the poster and I stuck it on the bulletin board there at the church. Next day I went out, guess what? It was gone. Okay. Innocent thing, but the subject of voting was obviously very sensitive. My office was a very small office, and I was the secretary, and I was the youth leader, and I was the pastor, and whatever else. I cut stencils on the typewriter and put them on the old mimeograph machine after I'd inked it down and ran the bulletins. And when Martha and I were married, she came in one day and said, "I'll be glad to help with the bulletin." And I thought, I don't know about that. I think I know how to do this. So she had to go back to the manse. Anyway, I do the Greenville Church bulletin on one side and the order for the smaller congregation on the back. So every week that was the pattern. It was a difficult time in many ways, and the town of Greenville on a Saturday, it was not unusual to walk downtown and see Ku Klux Klan folks walking around with their robes on, children as well with them, hats, the whole works. And the drinking fountains in that time were still labeled as, there's a white fountain and a black fountain. The single movie theater in town was the same way. The blacks sat up in the balcony and the whites downstairs. So it was a totally segregated kind of place. I never, at least before Martha and I were married, I never had a feeling of insecurity. I didn't feel like anybody was going to do me any physical harm. This is a kind of funny story, but the only time I had any physical harm threatened was I'd gone to sleep one night, and I guess it was about midnight, 1 o'clock, I don't know exactly what time it was now. All of a sudden, this terrible knock on the front door. Bang, bang, and I listened to it, and I realized that wasn't somebody's hand. There was somebody who had something in their hand was banging on the door. And I was awake enough to realize that there was nothing. If I opened that door, there was nothing there. There was no storm door on it. I was going to be face to face with somebody. So I had sense enough to go into the front bedroom and look out the window. And as I was looking out the window, I saw this man literally stumbling off the front steps and heading, sort of staggering back to the car. I could see in the car an image of a looked like a child, a young girl. He got in the car and gunned it and burned rubber and sped off. Well, what do? You go back to bed and hope he won't come back? I got in that Ford Galaxy and I drove around Greenville at night. Drove by Jack Williamson's house to see if anybody was up. Nobody was up. There was not a light on in Greenville. They rolled up the streets at night. So I rolled around a while. I figured if that guy showed up again, I could outrun him anyway because he was drunk. Well, the next night, I'd go over to the sanctuary and sit with the choir in choir practice. And as we were rehearsing for Sunday, the door opens on the far side of the room. The chairman of the Board of Deacons, Ben Tillman, does this to me. And so I got up and he said, "Go to the manse, get your stuff, you're coming to my house to spend the night." So I went and did exactly what he said. Well, as it turns out, his neighbor down the street, who was a member of the church, he and his wife and daughter, he was sitting out, he'd been seen sitting out on the front steps of his house cleaning his guns and telling everybody that came by he was going to go shoot the preacher. So he was an alcoholic, and he was in one of his alcoholic fits. I had been working with his wife on the Women of the Church program that they were going to do. It was a birthday offering for the women of the church. And he somehow got it in his head that I was making a play for his wife and he was going to get me. So it had nothing to do with race. It had to do with alcohol and the situation. when he was sober, he was a very nice guy. He drove the bread truck, and I'd see him on the street, and he would intentionally move to the other side of the street to avoid having any contact with me. Martha and I were married after I convinced her. We had planned to be married in May of '64, and I got to Greenville, and between the stress and the loneliness and the inability to cook, I was about to waste away. So thanks to her parents' willingness to move the date up, we moved it up to the 27th of December of all days. And neither of us can remember when I actually arrived up in Virginia for the wedding. I can't imagine being away at Christmas, but I must have been. So anyway, we were married on the 27th of December. We went to New York for our honeymoon. And had a wonderful time in New York. When I was ordained back in July of '63, my parents and brother and Martha had come down to Greenville, and we had bought appropriate furniture for the manse and done those sorts of things. And when I left to go for our wedding, I had the house all spiffed up, and it was just in great shape to bring my bride back to the house. We rolled in after our honeymoon, opened the front door. The curtains were disheveled, some of them knocked down, a lamp turned over. There was blood on the window. I couldn't figure out what in the world had gone on. Walked back to the bedroom. There was a Confederate flag spread across the bed. Was that a word? Be careful what you do, what you say. The dishevelment in the living room was because a squirrel had come down the chimney and couldn't get out. and had made the best effort it could to get away, and was found dead on the floor. But the Confederate flag was clearly a warning sign. Another warning sign was that one of the elders in the church, an elderly gentleman whose wife was also the organist, came by fairly regularly. Every time the American Communist Party published a Daily Worker, he'd come by and bring me a copy of the Daily Worker because it always had something about Martin Luther King in it. And he'd want me to read, make sure that I understood the connection between Martin Luther King and the Communist Party. And we'd have this back and forth, and I'd listen to him, and he'd finally get up and toddle on off. But that was, that was his way of telling me, what he and the other people in the community understood to be Martin Luther King's real modus operandi. One funny story about the church, and Martha will appreciate this. The choir director was also the high school band leader. And everything he did was sort of in march time. It didn't make any difference what the hymn was, or the anthem. And it got faster and faster as it went along. Well, one Sunday Martha was substituting as the organist, and the organ was just here. The pulpit's here. The organ was right over here, and the choir sat perpendicular to the congregation. And he was leading with his voice. He had this big baritone voice, a just booming voice, so that's the way he led things. And he was leading the hymn, and Martha was over here playing the organ, and it got faster and faster and faster, and I realized some commotion over here on the organ bench. Well, Martha's feet on the organ pedals were going so fast that she slipped off the bench. And had to pull herself back up, and then just kept right on playing. But it was one of those funny instances of life. Let me back up and talk a little bit about the call process, because you may wonder why in the world I ended up in Greenville, Alabama, and I still wonder. The process of a call, certainly in that day, in many instances had to do with people who knew each other. And one of the things that had happened in the Presbyterian Church was that we were in a struggle at that period of time. We were in a biblical and theological struggle. We were in a struggle about the nature of the Bible itself. And there were those within the denomination who were aware that the Scriptures didn't just suddenly drop down from God out of heaven, but that they had been formed over a period of time in certain ways by a wide variety of hands. And still there were those within the church who thought that the Bible was written by God and that it was inerrant in everything. I had been to college, and I knew from my college Bible courses that the Old Testament had sources in it. We called it J, E, D, and P. Some of you remember that from your Bible classes, that there was a strain of the Old Testament that was a J strain for Yahwist. The word God, when the word God appeared, the word was Yahweh. There was another strain that was a J strain, which was a different variety. There was an E strain, which was Elohim. Elohim was another word for God. And when you look at the creation narratives, you realize that one of them uses the word Yahweh, the other one uses the word Elohim, and those strains get put together. Some of you are smiling, so you know this theory about the development of the Scriptures. Well, that wasn't being bought in Greenville, Alabama, or in East Alabama Presbytery for the most part, because there was this unholy alliance, you see, between the religious fundamentalists and those who wanted to preserve the status quo. And we may talk about that next week because I think there are some contemporary connections here. John Leith was my professor at Union Seminary, taught historical theology. John had been the pastor at the Auburn Presbyterian Church for several years, and then after finishing his doctoral degree, went to Columbia Seminary and taught at Columbia for a short period of time, during which he was threatened with ecclesial action because of some of his words that he was teaching in his class that was out of line with the old Southern Presbyterian notions. And John eventually left and came up to Union Seminary. Union was a little more fertile ground for him because the Union Seminary at that point was about a decade, maybe a little more than a decade ahead of Columbia in terms of changing. Columbia was still at that point very much in a conservative, fundamentalist kind of mold in terms of the way they were teaching. So John Leith was one of my favorite professors at seminary, and I and several of his students were influenced by him to go to Alabama, back to where he had been. So John knew the Presbytery exec in Alabama, a layman by the name of Lynn Woodward. And Lynn then would get to a congregation like Greenville that had search committee ready, but probably not resources that they could go out and look all over the place for a new pastor. So they were in many ways dependent on recommendations, and particularly from those they trusted. So Lynn had put my name in the hopper at Greenville and Hugh Halberstadt over at Union Springs and others around. So that's the stream how some of us got down to Alabama, an effort to change the face of the church in a sense. So it may have had less to do with racial issues than it did having to do with biblical interpretation and theological approach. So the church in the process was changing enormously during that period of time. And we were caught up in that swirl. So as I came to the presbytery, and you heard some of in the movie, some of the men talk about the fact that their presbytery examinations were long. We met, there were 3 of us who were being examined by East Alabama Presbytery at the same time. 2 were Columbia graduates, one a very strict fundamentalist, the other one much more liberal, shall we say, and then I was from Union. We were in committee exam on the night before Presbytery for about 5 hours with all sorts of torture going on. Fortunately, there were compatriots, there were those who were, quote, on our side, seeing it the way we saw it in the committee. And then the next day on the floor of Presbytery, we were on the floor of Presbytery for another 4 or 5 hours. So, you know, just to give you an illustration, Bob Strong was a pastor at the Trinity Church in Montgomery, which was the largest and wealthiest church. Bob had come from the old Orthodox Presbyterian Church in the north down to Augusta, at First Church Augusta, was pastor in Augusta, and then came over to Trinity Church. And he could tie a Presbyterian a knot in parliamentary procedures, but on this particular day, he was interested to know if we believed in the historic Adam. That was one of the real catch questions. Do you believe that Adam was an actual person who lived in a specific time, and he even had a date? You know, he could give you the whole works. Well, you know, you play around with those things. How do you deal with it? Yes, well, there was an original man somewhere along the way, but those were the kinds of questions that they were trying to trick us into making statements about. And Presbytery could even be so organized as to people sitting in certain slots. Robert's Rules of Order indicates that the person furthest from the chair ought to be recognized by the chair. So people would even plot where they were going to sit in order for the chair to recognize them. Those sorts of games were going on constantly. So it was a mean and difficult time in many respects. Now, Jack Williamson, let me get back up to Jack for a minute, because in the middle of all this, and I didn't understand this at the time I was in Greenville, but it became clear shortly thereafter. Jack and Bob Strong in Montgomery were in process of developing a cadre of people who eventually would lead the schism of the Presbyterian Church U.S. into the Presbyterian Church in America, PCA. And they were in process of setting up a seminary in Jackson, Mississippi, which is a very conservative fundamentalist seminary. And they were about their adventure pretty clearly, and they worked through it. Jack Williamson eventually became the first moderator of the PCA. And I saw the other day his speech that he gave at the first General Assembly meeting of the Presbyterian Church in America, and it just was astounding to read it. It went on and on and on and said nothing. So the difficulties of the time, and I've got a paper here if any of you are interested. Vernon Broyles wrote a paper about all of that and the unholy alliance between the people who wanted to maintain the status quo and those who wanted to maintain the strict conservative fundamentalist view of the scriptures. And that game played out for a long time until the PCA folks pulled out in 1973 was the organization of the PCA, and that freed up a lot of it took out a lot of churches out of the denomination, but it also freed up a lot of our churches to be able to say who they were and what they believed, and it was a sad but nonetheless liberating experience.
Tom, it's hard to believe you actually made it to that church. I mean,
well, it is. It is. In some ways, it is, and yet it was a maturing process for me. I came. I still don't like conflict, and but I didn't know how to handle conflict. And I'll say to you that the worst racial turmoil I have been in was after this, when I moved to Roanoke, Virginia, and I was 2 years at Second Church as the assistant pastor, and moved over to Northminster Church in Roanoke, and this was during the poverty program time, and there was a total action against poverty daycare center in downtown Roanoke that ministered largely to black kids, and their building had some major problems, and they had to move out for a while, and they called out to Northminster to see if we could house them temporarily, which would have meant putting a fence up around our lovely church lawn. And the session approved it. The deacons were not happy about having to put up a fence, but I had the most racist calls about that that I can imagine. It was just a torrent of racial discriminatory calls, nasty stuff to me and to the church. So that was even worse than anything I experienced in Alabama. I could tell you about the Klan rally I went to. Didn't get to tell you that. I'll tell you quickly. Dallas Blanchard was a Methodist pastor, and after Martha came to Danville, we connected with Gene and Dallas. His church was up close to Fort Deposit, where my smaller church was, and we had seen an advertisement about a Klan rally. So Dallas and I got the wise idea that we'd go. We wanted to go. We wanted to see what this was about. And we wanted to see which of our parishioners were there, for one thing. And so it was right on the intersection of two highways, and there was sort of a bowl in the where it took place, and they had this flatbed truck down there and the PA system, and they had the big cross down on the other end, and they had a variety of speakers leading up to the Grand Dragons coming to speak, and this preacher was going to justify all this out of the Bible. See. So Dallas and I, we left the ladies in the car. We said, you all sit in the car up here and listen. We're going to go down and sit on the bank and kind of get in the middle of things. So Dallas pulls out a pen and he said, I'm going to take some notes here about how this guy's making these justifications. So he's sitting there writing, and all of a sudden we look up and here's this Klansman standing over top of us. You guys from the press? Oh, no, sir, we're not from the press. And he says, well, put those notes away then. Yes, sir, we will. So notes go back in the pocket. So that was the closest encounter we had with major trouble. But after the speech making, then they went off and burned the cross and got that done. So it was difficult. It was not a fun time. What I'd like for us to do next week is to spend some time thinking together about what the implications, what have we learned and what have we not learned? Where are the connections? What are we seeing today that has any similarity to some of this stuff. We all know that we're not through with this issue. It still burns in us. And we have to figure out how we're going to cope with it. But there are lots of other issues that we're dealing with today that may have some connections. So let's spend some time this week thinking about that, and then we'll come next Sunday and have some good discussion. Quick question, anybody? I've taken you right up to, and I've got to go get ready for worship. Okay, all right. We'll leave it there, and then next Sunday we can do any other conversations you want to have about it. Thank you. Appreciate it. Wait a minute. One other quick thing. I'm going to do this right quick. After I left, I got this letter from a fellow named Paul Tate, who was a college student in the congregation in Danville. It was dated December 7, 1964, typed. Dear Tom, I apologize for my delay in writing to let you know how utterly appalled I was to learn that you were no longer in the Greenville church. Upon seeing the enclosed news story in Saturday's Alabama Journal, I was immediately reminded that I should have written to you sooner. My sole intentions are to compliment you and to thank you for all that you did in the all too short time that you served the Greenville church. I regret now that I did not give you more moral support in your work, but being away at school, he was at Troy State, appears to handicap most generally all my good intentions. Nonetheless, you no doubt readily observed my total acceptance of you, your work, and your theological philosophy when I was in attendance for your services. I have yet to learn the details of your leaving, and apparently those who know them, care not to reveal them to me. You stand not alone, however, in your being ostracized, a poor word used only for lack of a better one. I have found a coldness and have detected an unacceptance of me from the past several times that I was in church. Unfortunately, its members cannot accept or even tolerate a person who has different political, moral, and spiritual beliefs. Tommy Engel, who was in the documentary, Tommy Engel at the church here has been receiving the same treatment. I trust, however, that all of us who cannot find acceptance in these places, in those places where most needed, will be able to justify in our minds the gross ignorances and hypocrisies which we encounter. I wish for you the best that life has to offer. Most sincerely, Paul Tate, Collegedale, Troy, Alabama. Interesting. Yeah.